Pocket tens is genuinely my favorite hand in No Limit Hold'em, and it has been for many years. And the reason is because if we think about where EV comes from in poker, it basically comes from playing hands in a different and better way than our opponent would play them if they were in our shoes. And I believe that pocket tens is the single hand where that is the most true, and therefore is the hand where the biggest skill gap exists. So here are some of the reasons that pocket tens allow top players to play them so much differently than weaker players. First of all, it's a hand that we are usually going to VPIP with, and we're often going to play big pots with it since they will somewhat often be 3-bet or 4-bet pots. Some of the edge comes from knowing when to be more aggressive or more passive with tens preflop, but the bulk of the edge with tens probably comes from postflop play. So pocket tens often have valuable blockers since they can either function as very relevant straight blockers on like a Jack 9-8 board in a spot where both players can have straights, or your tens can also function as proximity blockers on a queen high or a king high board, since a lot of top pair combos in one or both players' preflop range will also contain a 10. In either case, blocker effects can be valuable either for bluff catching or for turning our hand into a bluff in spots where a lot of players wouldn't necessarily find either one of those lines. Finally, there are a bunch of spots where we can go for thin value with pocket tens, for instance, on a river spot with 2 overcards, again, where many players are missing that value. So for all these reasons, again, I think it's the hand where the biggest skill gap is, and therefore it's the hand we can actually make the most money with in the long run. So for the rest of this video, I'm going to review 3 recent hands I played with pocket tens. I will go through each hand in the replayer first, and then use GTO Wizard to see what we can learn and how we can widen that skill gap. So let's get into these hands. So here's the first hand. This one is heads up, and we are a little more than 220 big blinds deep. I raise pocket tens on the button, and the big blind calls. Flop is 6-3 deuce with 2 hearts. I choose to go B67 here. Basically pairs like 7s through 10s that can push equity and also benefit from denying some equity tend to be super high frequency bets, whereas we can check back some overpairs sometimes, but I think I just choose to pure bet with pocket tens here, and my opponent called. Turn is the jack of clubs, and my opponent checks again. This spot I thought was interesting and was a little bit torn because I feel like we often want to bet again with the 10 of hearts, because when we do improve to a set on the river, it's always a clean set out, so we can potentially, win a big pot against a jack, and at the same time, we still get called on the turn by a bunch of worse hands as well. But I thought we didn't necessarily want to bet with the 10 of diamonds because we do block stuff like queen 10 of diamonds, which, might call the flop with a backdoor flush draw and then bluff the river if we check back. And those combos are not always going to 3-bet pre-flop, especially this deep. So ultimately I chose to usually bet with tens with the 10 of hearts, but check back this combo specifically because I did have the diamond. So I'm sort of interested to see what the solver thinks about that line and thought process. But anyway, we get to the river, which is the jack of diamonds. My opponent checks again. And here we don't want overbets because since we checked back the turn, our range is somewhat capped on this river, and out of position can still conceivably have some full houses. So I went for B67 for value, which is my standard size in a node like this. And my opponent called with queen 6 offsuit. So this is somewhat of a standard hand, but I think the turn suit nuance makes this hand interesting. So let's take a look in Wizard to see what the optimal strategy looks like. So here's the flop sim. It looks like the default c-bet size for imposition is B40, but let's change this to B67 since that's what I did, and I don't think it will affect our pot share too much. And if we look to our pocket tens, they are pretty much purely betting. Sort of like I said, these 7s through 10s are pure bets. And then as our pair increases, we can check back more often since these combos benefit less from denying equity. And specifically with aces, having the ace of diamonds or the ace of hearts block some continues that pocket aces do quite well against. So sort of makes sense to bet ace of spades, ace of clubs, and check back the other combos with some frequency. But anyway, we are sort of focusing on pocket tens, so we go for the bet and they call. Turn is the jack of clubs. Out of position is pure checking again. And here is what our turn c-bet strategy looks like. If we look at our pocket tens, yeah, it does look like the combos with a heart are betting at some frequency, and the combos with no heart are purely checking back, sort of for the reasons that I mentioned. But if we look at our combo specifically, the 10 of hearts, 10 of diamonds, it's basically evenly split between betting and checking. It looks like with a slight preference for checking. So ultimately, I do think it's sort of for the reasons that I mentioned. If we look at the big blind range here, you can see that the only queen 10 combos, for instance, that get to the turn are, the hearts and the diamonds. So we don't really want to block the queen 10 of diamonds. I would imagine in practice, players can have king 10 of diamonds here too. I think this sim just has them purely 3-betting that preflop, but I think at 220 big blinds deep, some players are for sure calling that preflop. So if that's true, I do sort of think that checking back tens with heart diamond is probably a higher frequency play, if not just a pure check. But yeah, I do think this is a good example of sort of the proximity blocker effect. And we do go for a check back, and the river is the jack of diamonds. Our opponent checks again. It does look like they are, trapping with some of these jack deuce, jack 3 combos. And it does look like in positions, single bet size is B67 here, and we are just purely value betting tens, which again, I think is pretty standard. Most players are probably finding this value bet, although I could see some weaker players maybe checking back or going for a smaller bet. So pretty well played hand, and cool to see that turn suit nuance play out in action. And let's move on to the next one. Here we have pocket tens in the small blind. The cutoff goes for a min raise. The button calls. And I decide to go for a squeeze with pocket tens, pretty standard so far. Cutoff goes for the 4-bet. The button folds, and preflop, I think this is usually a call against the 4-bet, so I go for the call. Flop is king 7 deuce two-tone. I think we're pure checking this board. And my opponent bets like 30% of the pot. And I thought for a while here and ultimately decided that given how strong villain's range is, I actually thought this was just a fold with no heart. So probably I would continue with tens with a heart, but folding with no heart. And I do think this is a spot where a lot of players just go for a call. So let's take a look in Wizard and check it out. So here's that 4-bet pot sim, small blind versus cutoff. We are purely checking in the small blind. As you can see, we usually do have pocket tens in our range for flatting the 4-bet. And in theory, it looks like cutoff strategy should just be to go B25 with range. Let's edit this to B30. It shouldn't make too much of a difference, but that is closer to the size that they actually used. So using this size, they're also betting with full range. And if we take a look at our pocket tens here, even tens with a heart are mixing call and fold. They are basically just indifferent, and the tens with no heart are purely folding, and it would actually be a big mistake to call. Losing 2% pot share in a 4-bet pot, which is inherently quite a big pot, it's a pretty big mistake. So even though this might seem like a trivial spot, we just, check folding tens on a king 7 deuce board. This is a spot where good players are going to find this fold, and weaker players are going to make a pretty significant mistake by calling. I'm a little bit curious if cutoff had only gone B25. Let's take a look at that real quick. So again, they're going B25 with range. And yeah, similar thing. Now we are almost pure calling with the tens with a heart, which sort of made sense because if at a slightly larger size we are indifferent, then when the size goes down, we should probably be continuing. But we are still pure folding tens with no heart. Again, even against this, very small bet size with a pair higher than second pair. So somewhat encouraging to see that this fold was not too nitty. And let's move on to the last hand. Here we have tens in the big blind. The hijack opens to 3x. It folds around to us, and pre-flop, this is a spot where I see a lot of players 3-bet, but we should actually usually be calling against the hijack and pretty much purely calling as we get even slightly deeper than 100 big blinds. So you can see we're around 115 big blinds effective to start this hand. So again, even pre-flop, this is a spot where we can find an edge against weaker players who just see pocket tens and want to put more money in the pot. Flop is jack 8 deuce two-tone. We go for a check. Our opponent bets half pot, and we have a very standard call. Turn is the 9 of hearts, which, brings us a straight draw and 2 straight blockers. We check again, and my opponent goes for b75. Here I decided to turn my hand into a bluff and raise. We should have a few more straights than the hijack here, and bluff raises on the turn often contain some amount of showdown value, and I didn't really expect hands worse than queen 10 to 3-bet me, so I thought this would be a decent spot to sometimes go for a raise, so I did go for it, and my opponent called. On this river, considering I was still uncapped, and now we clearly have the straight advantage, I decided to turn my hand into a bluff again, sometimes, and I went for a jam, and my opponent thought for a bit and folded. So let's check out the solver and see what we can learn about this spot. So first of all, here's the preflop spot. You can see that hijack goes for a 3x, and this is our defending range in the big blind, and this is for 100 big blinds effective. If we look at our pocket tens, they are calling the vast majority of the time. Obviously, we can 3-bet sometimes, but yeah, again, they are just usually calling. If we look at the same exact spot for 150 big blinds effective, you can see that now they are calling even more often, and the raise frequency goes down. So again, the deeper we get, the more often we should just be calling pocket tens here. It's probably a bigger mistake to pure 3-bet them than it is to pure call them. So we do go for the call, and here is the post-flop sim. In position, I believe just bet 50%. Small mistake to size down on this board. This is a very standard B67 c-bet board from the hijack, but they go B50, and no raises with pocket tens here, just purely calling. You can pause here if you want to take a look at what our overall continue range looks like, but we go for the call, and the turn is the 9 of hearts. Here we're checking again, and in positions, turn c-bet size again is B67. This is a very standard size after straights come in, but here they sized up to B75. And let's take a moment here to see what our raising range looks like. We obviously can have some queen 10 for value, some 10-7 for value, and then if we take a look at where bluffs are coming from, let's first take a look at our pocket tens. It actually looks like only tens with a diamond wants to, get in there as a bluff or a semi-bluff, whatever you want to call it. And it does seem like the other combos are just calls. Just as a reminder, I had spade club, so I did not have a diamond in this hand. And probably this is because we should first be drawing our bluffs from, it looks like these 10x with diamonds, and also these queen x combos with diamonds. So it seems like, blocking the straight and having the gut shot is valuable, but we want even more equity with a flush draw. And these combos have less showdown value, so probably all of these things are what makes raising them higher EV than calling with them. Whereas with tens with no diamond, it does look like calling is just higher EV than raising. So a bit of a mistake there on my part, but again, just goes to show you how much you can continue to improve with a hand like pocket tens. And one thing I kind of just want to make sure is that if we do go for a raise and hijack goes all in, yeah, so we're actually raise folding all of these 10x of diamonds and queen x of diamonds, which can seem a bit unfortunate, I guess. But the truth is that in position shouldn't really be jamming a whole lot, only 15%. And when they do jam, those combos actually don't have that much equity against their jamming range. So I guess we would rather benefit from fold equity on the turn and realize our equity when they call. The point is, it's okay to raise fold with a combo like a gut shot and a flush draw. And considering this raising range is obviously a bit more polar than how I was playing, the size is obviously larger. And let's take a look at what our river play should look like after we do raise and my opponent calls. And again, the river was the ace of hearts. Here it does look like we get to jam with most of the pocket tens combos that we do get here with. And even though these combos have some amount of showdown value against maybe a combo like king queen of diamonds, we would still rather bluff jam with them than, these diamond combos, just because having two diamonds blocks too many of our opponent's folds. And when we jam with pocket tens, we can still get, a handful of jack x to fold, probably some overpairs to fold, probably some ace x of diamonds to fold, stuff like that. So the river line seems fine, I guess, given how we got there. But yeah, main takeaway here is to play a bit more polar and equity driven with our turn raises in this situation. especially when in position can still have plenty of nut straight combos themselves. So those were some recent hands I played with pocket tens, and I think they show why I like this hand so much. You end up in a lot of spots where your decision isn't obvious and where small differences in how you think about ranges, blockers, value thresholds, both player strategies, that kind of thing, can have a pretty meaningful impact on EV. Obviously, 3 hands don't prove that pocket tens creates the biggest skill gap in poker, but I do think it's a hand that consistently gives good players more opportunities to outperform weaker players. So hopefully these examples gave you a few ideas for how to approach some of these spots. Let me know what you think in the comments. Let me know if you'd like to see more pocket tens hand history reviews or anything else you're interested in. If you found this useful, consider subscribing for more no limit strategy videos, and I will see you in the next one.